Tensions are soaring in the Middle East. The latest concerns involve Iran after a militia group they support claimed responsibility for a deadly drone attack at a U.S. military base in Jordan. U.S. forces have been operating in the area after a series of attacks by Houthi militants on vessels passing through the Red Sea. U.S. President Joe Biden plans to respond to the drone strike, raising fears of an even broader conflict.
We are not looking for a war with Iran. We are not seeking a conflict with the regime.
But we certainly don't seek a war, and frankly, we don't see Iran wanting to seek a war with the United States.
Matching statements from the U.S. Secretary of State and the Pentagon as concerns grow that a broader war in the Middle East could materialize.
Yes. I do hold them responsible in the sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it. We'll have that discussion.
President Joe Biden says he plans to respond to a weekend drone attack in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers and wounded more than 40 others. Biden says he holds Iran responsible for supplying the weapons used in the attack, but said he's not looking for a wider war in the Middle East. The one-way enemy attack drone approached the base around the same time as a U.S. surveillance drone, causing confusion and preventing defenses from being deployed. The enemy drone hit the living quarters of the base early in the morning while troops were still sleeping.
We know there are still many questions, to include how the one-way attack drone could have penetrated the facility's air defenses, its point of origin, and which specific Iranian proxy group is responsible. What we do know is that Iran-backed militias are responsible for these continued attacks on U.S. forces, and that we will respond at a time and manner of our choosing.
A U.S. official tells ABC News that the response to the drone attack will be carried out over the course of several days and strike multiple targets. The anonymous official also told ABC they're going to be very deliberate targets and strikes on facilities that enabled the attacks, but would not say whether any of the targets would be inside or outside Iran.
I don't think we could be any more clear that we have called on the Iranian proxy groups to stop their attacks. They have not. There has been 3 attacks, to my knowledge, since the 28th of January.
The options right now could be more intense strikes on some of the Iranian militias that have been launching these attacks, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq. There's also the option, and we've already seen that some, including members of Congress, have been calling for direct strikes on Iran. I don't anticipate that we will see the Pentagon go that far.
Sunday's deadly attack is a dramatic escalation in the months-long tension between Iran-backed militants and U.S. forces stationed in Iraq and Syria. Since mid-October, there have been at least 165 attacks on troops in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. The U.S. has launched several retaliatory strikes, including in Iraq. For more background on the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran, we're joined on Trending Now by David Welch, Research Chair and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. First question for you, David. How did this all start?
Well, the Middle East is a hornet's nest, and there are many different actors. And there are many clients and, to a lesser extent, proxies of major players. It's a complicated web of enmity, so it's not a place where the enemy of my enemy is my friend necessarily holds to be true. And what has happened recently in Jordan with the drone attack on American forces is that a group that is supported by Iran launched attack on Americans at a base, which is not uncommon. Americans mistook the drone for one of their own, did not intercept it, which they could have done. And the result was 3 dead American servicemen. So the initial response from Washington, of course, was to blame Iran. But this is not a case where there's any clear evidence whatsoever that Iran directed this, even wished for it. It was almost certainly an act done entirely by a group which is not entirely within Iran's control or under Iran's control. And so to what extent does it make sense to blame Iran for actually doing this attack, and to what extent does it make sense to retaliate against Iran specifically?
Now, part of the reason why U.S. forces have been more active in the Middle East in recent weeks is because of attempts to combat Houthi militants targeting ships in the Red Sea. But does the U.S. have any jurisdiction to be solving conflicts in the Middle East?
Well, you ask a question about jurisdiction. Technically, they don't have much in the way of jurisdiction. So a lot of what's happening in the Middle East is political activity, military activity that is not effectively being governed by international law. Now, the United States does have a right to defend itself. All countries do have a legal right to defend themselves. In taking action against the Houthis to protect shipping in the Red Sea, the Americans are actually upholding international legal rights to freedom of navigation. So arguably, they do have a strong legal basis for that. But when you lob missiles at a country to punish them for supporting a group who's attacked you, it's tenuous. The case is tenuous that that's a self-defense act, an act of self-defense. And so it's not clear that it's got a very strong legal basis at all. Whenever you get conflict, everybody thinks they're the wrong party. And so they think they're on the side of righteousness when they retaliate. Well, that's a recipe for escalation. What's really happening here is we're seeing the fog of war in all its glory. A lot of people making mistakes, a lot of people not knowing what others are doing, would not have approved it if they had known about it. This goes all the way back to October 7th. Yes, Hamas did have some support from Iran, but Iran was furious that Hamas attacked on October 7th without giving them any warning. They would have argued strongly against it if they'd known it was coming, and so forth and so on. So the good news here is both the Americans and the Iranians do not want this to escalate. I'd be very surprised if we see this escalating because nobody has an interest in that happening. If it does happen, it's going to be a result of inadvertence or incompetence.
So you don't think that this will turn into an all-out war?
If I were making the decisions in the White House, I would try to retaliate against the group that launched the drones against American forces. They're the ones who perpetrated the attack, so they're the ones I would focus my ire on. I would not retaliate against Iran. I think that would be a needless escalatory provocation. And the situation in the Middle East right now is delicate enough. You don't need to make it more delicate. I think it's usually a mistake to react to anything really quickly. Probably want to wait until you've got all the information in that you're going to get. You probably want to explore as many options as possible that are more peaceful and less escalatory.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Trending Now, David.
My pleasure.